Welcome back, everybody, to The New Normal. I'm Sal, and with me, as always, is my good friend, Quentin. Say hi to everybody, Quentin.
What's up, guys?
It has been a little bit of time since our last episode, and we want to thank everybody who's been pressuring us to get back on the microphone and saying, where are you guys? We've had a lot of things happen over the last month of August with hurricanes coming to the southeast Texas region, Louisiana area. I had internet issues in relationship to that. Quentin, you've got family things going on. You know what?
I had internet problems too. It was really the hurricane that kind of like shot the show down.
It really did. It was terrible. I mean, we were very blessed in our area. We were very west of the eye wall, but it was still just a huge cluster on our just life in general caught up with us. But again, thank you to our listeners for sticking with us, for following us on our Facebook page and Instagram. You know what to do. We want you guys to subscribe to the show. If you're interested, follow us on Facebook. You can find everything at newnormalpod.com. But without further ado, I want to introduce our guest today. She is an amazing, bright-spirited young lady by the name of Jen Horling. She's also a newly is it newly minted, or is this your second, third, fourth? Are you a newly minted author?
I would say newly minted author. Let's say that.
Nice. Well, welcome to the show, Jen. We want to thank you so much for coming on to The New Normal. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we are going to spend some time with you talking about a very sensitive topic. So I do want to be, cautiously optimistic that folks will be able to stick around and hear this message, because it is going to talk about suicide. It is going to talk about a very serious topic. So I do want to at least put out a trigger warning out there. If anybody has some sensitivities around this topic, I would encourage you to try to listen through the whole way, but we will dive into some sensitive topics. If suicide is obviously an issue with yourself, or you've had those thoughts and you've had family or friends that are experiencing that, we would encourage you to seek out some professional help. And I think, Jen, you might be able to get into some areas where those resources will be available.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. So Jen, tell us a little bit about yourself. What got you started in life? Like what drives you? How did you get into this, the game that you're in? I know for our audience who isn't familiar with this, you're a production designer, a graphic designer. You've been on Hell's Kitchen as a production designer. You recently just had some credits attributed to a movie that was recently released. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're all about?
Absolutely. It's been a wild ride, let me say that. A journey that I didn't expect life to go the way that it has. But the only way I can summarize that is to say God is a lot bigger than we think he is. And where I was 16 years ago, going through the horrific loss that I did, which we'll get into, is not where I am today. And life has definitely taken a lot of twists and turns and had a lot of surprising, fun things happen, which I'll, give credit to God for doing in the aftermath of some really horrible stuff. So I don't know where people are at right now that are listening today, but if you're going through anything difficult or hard, or even loss itself, where you're at right now is not the end. And that's kind of the gist of my story. And right now I'm kind of wearing multiple different hats. Like you said, I run a graphic design firm, which has kind of exploded in the last few years. But that's what I went to school for, was graphic design, which then in the last 5 to 7 years kind of expanded into working into the entertainment production world, working on all kinds of, music videos, commercials, TV shows, movies. And then in the last year and a half now, an author. So yeah, that's the gist of where we're at today. Definitely not a road I thought I'd be at this point. But
that's awesome. What got you into the fine arts area? Was it just a natural passion and design for that specific medium? Did you need a creative outlet? What led you into the graphic design world?
It's actually really, really interesting. I had no idea graphic design was even a profession. I was in college. I had just lost my dad to suicide, and I had no idea what to do with my life. All I knew was that I had some interests in art, and I had no interest in math, science, history, reading, you name it. So I had really no desire to go to a university or anything and get a crazy college degree. But I wanted to pursue some art. So I went to a local community college, took a few art programs, and was just looking through all of the curriculum, and I was like, graphic design, what's that? That sounds like fun. Took a few classes and fell in love with it. And God just continued to lead me step by step down this path to where I am today. And it just became, evolved into different things as time has gone by. And I fall in love with new facets of how to be creative and use the talents and skill sets that he's given me. But, well, at the same token, I had been through horrific loss. So I also didn't want to use what I was learning to just sell something to somebody. I wanted to use it to minister to people's hearts. So that was kind of like brewing at the same time as I was pursuing this art degree. I knew that deep down it had to mean something, and it had to be used for something greater later.
Right.
But that's where we're at today. It's kind of starting to transition, which is exciting.
I heard a really great quote not too long ago on another podcast that I'd love to get your reaction to and kind of your thoughts. Parents always tell kids, and they kind of squander at the arts, and they say, you need to get a real job. There's no money in being an artist, whether you're a singer in a band, whether you are a graphic designer, the whole stereotypical starving artist cliche that comes with being in the arts, while at the same time consuming art daily. We've got media companies, we've got movies, we've got art in itself as a fine art. What are your thoughts on parents who are discouraging their children from being in the arts because it's quote unquote not a real job? And then at the same time having that hypocritical stance of, we're going to consume all this art by artists who went to school, who did this to get into a profession. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, on one side, I can understand the fear that is associated with those decisions in that profession, because it is an unknown, and oftentimes you can see the statistics. But on the other hand, I would challenge that fear and say, wait a minute, God is a lot bigger than any of this fear. And I would tell that person to dream as big as you can, and don't let anything convince you otherwise, because he can do more than any of us can do. And I've seen that be proven true in my own life. He gave you those talents. He gave you those interests. He gave you those desires for a reason. And if you put them inside of you, they should come out.
For sure.
So
now you are, I would say, probably the fourth or fifth Dani Johnson graduates that we have had on the show. And it's such a great network, and it's such a great group of folks to bring on to a show like this, where we're discussing what the new normal is and what it means to certain individuals. Can you tell me a little bit about what led you into how did you find the Dani Johnson community? And I know you've been to pretty much every event as she schedules them. How do you justify that? And it's kind of one of those, did the chicken or the egg come first? I hear a lot of complaints about, I can't go to these events every single time because it's such a financial strain. But then if you apply what you learn at every single event, you 10x your revenue. So it's just like, well, now I can justify it because I'm applying everything. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you got into the Dani Johnson community, what you've gotten out of it, and how you would encourage others to find that information?
absolutely. Yeah. Everything you just said is so true. There's no doubt in my mind I wouldn't be where I am today in so many different facets of my life. And we're talking just 2.25 years that I've been involved in the community, been attending events, and have found Dani. It's really only been 2.25 years for me. And I can tell you every facet of my life has been so drastically affected and grown exponentially from where it was 2.25 years ago, that like I can credit that fully to obviously God, and this community and the coach pushing me harder and farther than I thought I could ever go. I found our coach actually from a friend of mine who I had worked on a film set with. His name is Shane Roby. He's a fantastic gentleman, has an amazing heart, has a desire to actually help change the industry, and wants to create environments where people are honoring, where you can trust each other, that we're not like bulldozing over each other. And there's so much of that in the industry. I think it's a really beautiful message that he wants to change. And so I knew this friend prior to attending events. And then he attended, and I started seeing all these changes happening in his life, changes in his finances, his relationships, his health, his physical health. And it was a really short period of time. I was like, this is amazing. And I was almost like, in disbelief that this could be happening to somebody this fast. And then he shared with me how at events, they can train you how to work in a team aspect like that. How do you work in an environment and show honor and show love and show respect? And they teach teams to do that. I was like, oh my gosh, that sounds amazing. That's what we've been talking about. So I knew I had to go check it out, and it didn't take long to convince me. I was pretty much there in 2 events and was completely blown away. And to answer your question of, what is the value of continuing to go back, and why do I go back even though I quote unquote can't afford it? I can tell you this. When I went to my first event, Dani gives this line of, give me a year of your life and then you won't recognize it a year later. It's so true. I was at the point where I knew things needed to change, and they had to change. And I was desperate for that dream that was inside of me to become my life. And I knew that if I couldn't get there, then was this life even worth it? Like that, I cared about people and helping people so much that was like, I have to give this a shot. I have to see if this is true. And sure enough, it proved exponentially true, because that year I hit, since I started, I hit every single event. And I didn't hit every single event because I had all the money. I made the decision and the choice to invest in myself and say, this is worth it. This is worth it. The dream is worth it. The vision is worth it for me to find out if this is possible.
Yeah.
And in a matter of 1 year, I had tripled my business's finances. I had tripled my personal income. I had paid off over $20,000 worth of debt. I went from a team of just 2 people to a team of over 10. Multiple friends and family came to events and started, experiencing freedom in their life. But even that is like not even the most valuable thing you learn in attending events. To me, the most valuable thing is like the internal healing that can happen, and the healing of your heart, and just seeing that shift and new freedoms come as you work through different things they teach you and walk you through there is really the most beneficial and valuable thing that you get from attending.
For sure. I've told a lot of friends that it's the best bait and switch tactic in the world, because I originally went as one of those, I'll give it a try. Again, a friend, the good drug dealer approach, give them a little taste and then make them come back for more. But I had a friend who, gave me the book. We've talked about the book so many times here. We had talked about Dani in the past. He sent me a couple of videos that her and Hans had done on the balcony of their lovely home. And I'm like, here we go. And, he gave me the book and he said, just give this a try and see what happens. And he ended up buying a First Steps to Success ticket for Orlando. And he goes, if you can get here, you can stay in our RV. We're going to be at an RV park just down the road and we'll take you every day. But if you can get there, I think it'll change your life. I'm like, I'm starting to read the book as he's at First Steps to Success, because obviously I didn't make it. I'm reading the first 3 chapters and I'm literally reading me. And that's the scariest part, is like, I'll go when I have money. Oh, it's too far. I don't think I could do it because, it's just another guru pitching something. And I'm reading all my excuses as a mirror. And I'm just like, oh, I can't believe it. I was like, well, if she comes to Houston, because we're in that area, then I'll go. And then I'm like thinking, of course she's not going to come to Houston anytime soon. That Sunday, I get a text message from my friend, Scott Blair. He says, hey, dude, guess what? Next conference is in Houston. What is your excuse? He said. I'm like, So I got it. I got the funds together. I went, and without overstating it, without over exaggerating, to your point, it quite literally changed everything. Everything about how I looked at my finances, everything how I looked at my business, how I looked at relationships. It's that 3 tiers that is a part of the conferences, but you go in kind of like, oh, I'm going to improve my finances. Oh, I'm going to improve my selling techniques. And you come out of it realizing that there's an emotional side that needs healing. There's a spiritual side that needs healing. There's a family dynamic that needs healing. And you're like, flipping everything on its head because your priorities are so out of whack. And I remember writing this down in my notebook during the conferences because she talked about Pharaoh and Abraham and the differences between the two. Are you Pharaoh or are you Abraham? And that just stuck. I mean, it was like a knife, because the principle behind that was, are you ruling your home in fear because Pharaoh was afraid to lose power? Or are you raising your home? Are you running your home in faith? Because Abraham had faith. And I was just like, oh my God. And I just broke down. I had Sam Wender, who was right next to me, and his daughters. A lot of great connections that have been made through that. But I mean, to your point, it's a life-changing experience that can really dynamically change your life for the better. If there's a huge caveat to that, you are coachable, teachable, and you are willing to put in the work. That's anything in life. You're never going to not hear this from someone who's truly selling something that works, right? These get rich quick, these quick fixes, they never work for that reason, because you don't have to put any work into it. Mm-hmm. You mentioned something about parents and fear for their children, going into the arts. Can you expand a little bit about, how fear can take hold of someone's life, and kind of that transitions into our topic for the day? What is it about fear that holds people back, in your opinion, from truly having a powerful life?
Well, yeah, you totally nailed it. And that even relates to, I think, also what sets these conferences apart and that is, a lot of these self-help gurus and speakers out there. There's a difference from them and what we experience, I think, at Dani's events, and that is what she's teaching about comes from the Bible, and it comes from an actual promise. And since it's a promise, that is from the Father. So if you are actually taking action and listening to what they teach you, it's going to come true. Like what other self-help system out there can guarantee results if you take action? Well, when it's based on God's word and it's a promise, it's a guarantee. And so that also relates to the topic of fear, and the fact that fear stopping you is because you're listening to other voices other than the Father. And when you're able to distinguish what voice is speaking to you, is it your own mind? Is it fear? Is it lies? Or is it the Father? And learning to distinguish which voice it is so important. And I think that boils it down to where that fear comes from. Fear comes from. It's not the Father. It's a lie from the enemy, or even from your own confusion, your own struggles, your own hesitations, and learning that difference is so important.
How would you say someone can go about learning that difference? Like, what has been your method? Obviously we don't want to say use Jen's method, use Sal's method, use Dani's method, but is there a formula? Is there a good technique? Is there a path that one could take to recognize fear over faith in how they're navigating their life?
Absolutely. Well, if you break it down, I mean, think about the way that fear speaks to you. Fear speaks from a perspective of you can't do it, it's too hard, you're not good enough. They're all negatives. Those are based in fear, and that's not the Father's heart. That's not the Father's voice. That's not how he feels about you. If you're wondering how he feels about you and you want to know his voice, all you need to do is read his word. And as you read his word, you're going to see how he speaks. I would actually encourage you to take the Bible, start reading it, and actually highlight anytime you hear the Father speak and notice the patterns of the way that he speaks to those that he loves. There's a pattern. There's a way that he speaks. He speaks out of love. He doesn't speak out of like trying to condemn you to fear, to be full of fear.
And we're commanded to be courageous. We're commanded to not have fear. I mean, that's one of those huge aspects of the Bible that people, I believe, take strongly out of context, in that, you know, there's apparently two different gods, the God of the Old Testament and the God in the New Testament. I'm like, well, the only thing that separates the two is the blank page right before Matthew. It's one story. It's one narrative. It's one God that is reaching out to his children and commanding them. You know, when you use the word command versus instructing or telling, there's a lot of difference with, you know, how you navigate that perspective. He's literally commanding. This is the God of the universe. This is the all-seeing, all-knowing, omnipotent God who is commanding you, do not have fear. You know, we look at the 12 spies, or rather the 10 spies that came back with a negative report, and we navigate our lives through the 10 spies' bad report instead of listening to the small voices, if you will, that are telling us, no, we can do this. Our God goes before us.
Yes.
We can have, you know, victory wherever it might be. But we pay attention to the 10 spies that are saying, oh, there's giants, there's fortified cities, we look like grasshoppers. And obviously you can replace that with any sort of metaphor that you want. You know, the job is too hard, I'm not good enough for that job. And how that can lead down to a path of just, and this is another topic that I want to get into. I think it leads into, again, the topic that you want to get into, but guilt versus shame. There's a very, oh man, I get kind of choked up even thinking about the quote, but I heard it in another podcast with, it was on the Lewis Howes podcast. Just absolutely powerful. I'd have to bring up who the guest was, but we'll put it in the show notes. And the quote talked about guilt versus shame. And guilt is, I'm sorry that I did something that was the problem. What I did was the problem. And I'm sorry for it. I'm guilty. I'm repenting. Shame is, I'm sorry that I am the problem. And it was just such a powerful, I mean, like, I was moved when I heard it, and I had to stop the podcast, rewind it, and listen to it again. And I was just absolutely floored by that concept of guilt versus shame. Can you talk to us a little bit about how guilt and shame work into the topic of suicide?
Sure. First, I'd love to respond to the whole thing about fear, and something that hit me as you were talking was, it's not that people like you read about in God's word didn't have fear, but it's what they chose to do in spite of the fear. So like, you take David, in the story of David and Goliath, for example, when no one else wanted to fight Goliath, what did he do? He chose, despite his fear, to say, I'll do it. And why did he say that? Because he knew his Yahweh, was with him. And so it's not that fear was gone, it's what he decided to do anyways. And he knew that his God was going to be with him. He knew that his God loved him and that he wasn't going to be alone in that battle. But yeah, talking about guilt and shame, it's such an interesting subject matter, because so much of this life, as we're dealing with things that happen and choices that we make, it's so easy to end up in that boat where you're beating yourself up. But in all reality, we were designed to work through that stuff with the Father and not experience shame. Those feelings were meant to bring us into intimacy with the Father, and to have healing and to be forgiven. Like, those are actually what's supposed to drive us to him and to a deeper relationship with him. We're not meant to feel shame. We're meant to feel a more intimate relationship with the Father, because he wants us to come to him. And so that's supposed to be what's driving us to him, versus feeling the condemnation for that.
For sure. And can you lead us into, before you actually do that, Jen's book called Finding His Name. I'm gonna put that on the screen just like you are. With the my crossed out. It's available on Amazon. We'll have a link to it in the show description. but I want to read the very first, well, not the first page, but the acknowledgments. I thought it was very powerful. And I'd love for you to just kind of talk about, what led you into writing this book, what led you into this topic. It says, Dad, thank you for who you are. Thank you for showing me what an authentic and passionate love for the Father looks like. You loved him more than anything else in this life. I saw it in how you pursued him, how you dove deep into the scriptures, searching out further context, culture, and history. I'll never forget your hunger for him and the joy that radiated from your entire being the day that you called home while touring the Holy Land and a few years before your passing. And you go on to talk about the acknowledgments, but what led you to talk about this topic? What was the antithesis, the catalyst that got you into this topic and then ultimately writing this book?
Well, kind of like when you first started our call today, you gave that preface of like, if this is a sensitive subject for anybody, just as the trigger warning. And that very thing is such a thing where people are afraid to talk about suicide. There's certain things that people are afraid to talk about. And I get it. It's a very uncomfortable subject. But at the same token, even though it's uncomfortable, there's people who are hurting. There's people who are struggling. There's people who are suicidal and they need help. And I can't tell you how many, days have gone by where I wished that I could have gone back and said something or done something for my dad. None of us knew that he was struggling as much as he was. And so, now I'm at this place where I don't want to not be a voice in an area where so much help is needed, so much attention needs to be on this subject matter because it's a big problem and we're not talking about it. And so that's really why this book has come about, is I want to get it in the hands of people who are hurting and they're afraid to talk about this subject.
So can you talk to me a little bit about you were mentioning, was it your father's suicide?
Yeah. Yep. So 16 years ago, I lost my dad to suicide. I came home one day and found out my dad had ended his life. He had shot himself in the head. No note, no explanation. He was just gone. And he was a fighterman. He was a Vietnam veteran. He was an EMT responder. He was trained in FEMA. He was, in my mind, James Bond. And so, and a few others that have joked calling him that. And he, like I said in the book, he loved the Father intensely. And I'd always walk into his room and find him in his word, reading the Bible or reading concordances and digging and finding stuff and wanting to share it with us. So having him get to the place where he was at and none of us knew was crazy. It was definitely crazy.
So you talk about, the not seeing the signs or not knowing that what was going on. He was obviously devout and he was very involved in his community. In hindsight, would you say that you were able to kind of dissect over the last few years and then obviously pouring into this project as an author, were there signs after the fact that you can say, I should have reached out, or this is definitely something that, post-traumatic stress may have been a factor? What were some of those things that you maybe saw in hindsight that you were like, oh, there were signs, but we just kind of passed them off because, oh, it's just Dad. He can handle it. He can brush it off.
Yeah, no, there were definitely, I think, signs that looking back on it, we could have given more attention to. He was starting to deal with, nothing was officially diagnosed, but he was starting to deal with paranoia and being delusional and seeing things that weren't really there. And so there were just these little things that were happening that were out of the norm and seemed excessive and obsessive in behavior. And so while these things were starting to happen at that time, even PTSD wasn't really a thing yet. And so if I had to guess, I would say that he was majorly dealing with PTSD. Not only did we not know it, but he himself probably didn't know it either. And so
that's for sure PTSD. especially later in life, dealing with those types of symptoms. That's not like sudden onset of schizophrenia when you're in your 20s or something like that. That's for sure a carryover from PTSD.
Yep. Yep. So yeah, he was probably dealing with all this stuff internally. And, you know, we didn't really know the depth of that struggle, the depth of that battle that was going on until it was too late. And so, you know, I'm so grateful that, you know, now PTSD is something that's being talked about. And I think we need to open up those avenues of what we're talking about further, because it's still a major problem.
How would you respond to someone, you know, knowing that your father was devout in reading scripture, and, you know, you open up your book as an acknowledgement to his, you know, pursuit of scripture and pursuit of God? How do you respond to someone who says, well, if he had God in his life, why did he commit suicide? What would be your take on that? And how do you reconcile, well, if he was close to God, then he should have not had those thoughts?
You know, it's a hard thing. And, you know, a lot of people, you know, wonder about, you know, suicide and what happens to somebody when they commit suicide. Well, I can tell you without a shadow of doubt, there is no doubt in my mind that my father is in eternity, because he, like I said in the book, he loved his God more than anyone else that I ever knew. And so, you know, it's a hard thing. You know, mental health is a big problem, and the things that we go through in life can develop roots inside of us that we don't always know how to dig up and get rid of and heal. And so there's no doubt in my mind also that he had some major stuff going on inside that he didn't know how to deal with, yet he loved his father. So there was this battle going on on his insides that he didn't know how to navigate. And eventually his own mind gave up. And so, you know, that's why it's so on my heart to help those not get to that place.
I agree with what you said. I was a cop for a long time. And I would say, I don't know if I would say that suicide was the leading cause of death that I saw, but if it wasn't the leading cause of death that I saw, it was tied with like car wrecks. And it might have actually been more suicide actually. But, you know, I'm not a follower of any sort of Christianity or Abrahamic faith, but I will tell you this, I was at one time in my life, and I read the Bible very religiously, and I agree with what you're saying. I don't think that, like, it's something I struggled with when I was a cop. I'd always have these people, I'd go to their houses and I'd say, you know, my dad, I only saw men do this. I've never seen a woman commit suicide. And you know, they'd always say, you know, my dad is in hell, I'll never see my dad again. And I was like, that's not in the Bible anywhere. I've never read that. I don't believe that. That's just patently false. I feel like that's some sort of Catholic doctrine that was invented later on because people, you know, I think there was actually a suicide epidemic in the Middle Ages with the Black Death, and they just invented this. But there's no reason to believe that. And I talk to people about that all the time. But I mean, that what I saw with suicides is probably the thing that will stick with me in my career the longest. I've seen some other nasty murders, and I've seen some nasty car wrecks and stuff like that, but the suicides were bad, and the way it affected the families were even worse. And I actually just had a conversation on one of my friends' Facebook pages about this. I've seen men commit suicide any way you can imagine, and every time it would be one of their children that found them, almost without fail. And I will never forget the screams of those kids. It will be with me forever. And there was a guy I was talking to on this page, and he was, you know, contemplating doing the same thing. And, you know, I said, I will tell you what, if I could record what happens to a family after you pull the trigger or you do this and play it back for you, this would never, ever go through your head. And it's something that I can't describe to most people. You'd have to be there. And I think he said that really woke him up. You don't think about these things. You get very caught up in the moment and in what's going on in your own head. And that is not to take away from what is happening inside of somebody's head. It can be bad. And the scars I got left with from that career were pretty bad. And I was in a pretty bad place too when I left. So I totally sympathize with those who are going through this, because I've been there, and at some point, I don't know what there was about it to embrace, but I just embraced my experiences, and I'm actually really glad I was there. And it was the point where it was almost as if fate was putting me in these situations. I was on vacation once, and I was on vacation in the house next door. I was trying to get away from this. I'd actually just had a really bad week, and the house next door, a boy's father had just hung himself in the house. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. This cannot be happening. Because I heard the kid, and when you hear it, you know. And I heard the kid come out and scream, and I knew somebody was dead. And I knew it was somebody they cared about. And I went over there, and I had to cut his dad down. But I got to sit, and I made sure there was no foul play or anything like that. I called the local sheriff's department and sat there, and I was a cop, and I gave, my witness statement. But I sat with the kid, and I just hugged him. And it was really hard, but I was there, and I'm actually really glad I was. And it's taken me years to admit that, because it's really hard. It's hard in its own way to admit that you are glad to be in a situation like that. But the impact you can have on somebody's life, the impact you're having on people's lives with your book from this experience, there's no telling how many lives you could save with this. I don't know what I did for those kids in those situations, or those families, or the daughter I talked to in a similar situation to you. And I told her, your dad's not going to hell. You'll see your dad again. And there's a lot of people that I worked with that were just like robots. They were just not capable of connecting. They just refused to do it. They refused to connect with these people and to be the support they needed in that moment, because you're either not allowed to, because it's against department policy to show any sort of leanings toward a faith or whatever. I just threw that crap out the window. At that time, I actually was a Christian, but I was really towards the end of my career, I was really not at all. But it didn't matter to me, and I was going to be there spiritually in whatever capacity I could for that person when it was when that was occurring. And most officers just will not do that. They will not let the barrier fall. And so, that's my experience in kind of a very small nutshell. But I'm this is a big topic now, especially with everything that's happened, and then the video that came out, I guess, last week. But it's your message is definitely one people need to hear.
Yeah, the fact that someone would even use a platform like social media to live stream their own suicide, and then I hate to use this terminology, but I can't think of anything. The sick, perverse desire to then want to share it as if it's something to be glorified or even just looked at like some sort of sideshow. So we talked about.
I think it's just pain, man. I think that guy was just in pain, and I think he wanted somebody to know how much pain he was in.
Shared it on social media.
Oh yeah.
Reshared it and reshared it. I mean, so much to the point that people were putting alerts on their own Facebook, keep your kids off of TikTok for the next week. I mean, that it even had to be that, and it gets into a whole privacy and freedom of speech aspect of what should and shouldn't be allowed on social media. But how do you stop someone who's in the midst of a live transmission? We were starting to dive into the effects of suicide on family. So I'd love to get Jen's perspective on how it affected you at such a young age and where you are now into getting into the book. But before we do that, I was one of those people, that guy who was like, man, suicide is weak. You are weak-minded. You could have sought help. It's easy. Just reach out. What's your problem? And it took not necessarily a personal experience, but just maturity. Quite frankly, it just took that maturity and growing, doing more analyzing, doing more soul searching and scripture searching, and realizing that, and even having my own guilt and shame that was bottled up inside, and how that could lead down a dark path. Can you talk to me a little about, or can you talk to those individuals who are just like, you know what, suicide is weak. People who do that are weak. They don't have the, intestinal fortitude, the mental fortitude. They deserve what they got. How do you react to someone who's that cold and just dismissive of what's going on in someone to lead to suicide?
I don't know the quote, but there is something out there that speaks to the fact of being kind because you don't know the battle that someone else is currently going through. And that's exactly the quote that I would use in this instance of, you don't know what that person is dealing with. You don't know what they're carrying. You don't know what they've been through. You don't know their story. And so I would just, make that plug to say, like, if you don't know their story, then don't make that conclusion. They're probably full of pain. They're full of so much heartache, so much rejection, so much fear, so much internal struggle. And they're probably already beating themselves up so much to the point that they don't hear anything other than how horrible they are. And so, or they only see their pain. And so what drives a person to get to that place is a story that you don't know. And so that's really what the book is trying to reach. It's twofold. It's trying to reach that person that is stuck where they're at, and they're kind of now in like tunnel vision, and they think that where they're at right now is the end. There's not going to be anything else for them. This is it. It's trying to give that message and that vision that no, there is yet more ahead. There's a future you are meant for. There's a future you are designed for by the creator of the universe. And so it's giving that 16-year story of, okay, I've been there. I was there too. I was at that place where I was like, is this it? Is this all there is? And this is a glimpse of 16 years where now, 16 years later, I can't believe what life is. Where you're at right now is not the end. Not only for that person who is dealing with that internal battle, but as well giving that glimpse to those who have now lost somebody to suicide or gone through loss in general, of how does that affect a family? How does that affect those that you love? And letting you see kind of behind the curtain to the ripple effect of what that then causes. And so it's really twofold. It's for both sides.
I'd also like to say, just from a philosophical standpoint, people who think that people who commit suicide are weak, or they're somehow lesser, or they're cowards or something, it's like, there's nothing scarier than what they're doing. Like that's, they don't, I mean, you can profess, all you want where you're going when you die, but truthfully, you from a philosophical standpoint, you have no idea what is the next that's happening. So that should indicate to somebody how much suffering an individual is going through to take that step. And instead of criticizing and chastising somebody who is in the throes of this type of depression or deep struggling with this type of situation, maybe reach out to them and find out what it is that, put them there. And a lot of people won't open up. I can tell you, when I was having issues, there was no way I was going to open up with people. I almost didn't talk about what I shared today, and it's very minute what I did share. It's very hard, a lot of the things that I've been through, to share with people. But it's so critical to do that. But you have to, the person to share, they have to have ears to, have to have somebody listening to them and hearing them, actually hearing them, not just sitting in the room while they talk. No one listens to each other these days. No one takes the time. It won't take 5 minutes. And when they do, it's always from some sort of presupposed position on that person's life or existence. It's never real communication or compassion. Our society's become so disconnected. And as much as I hate to say it, that poor guy that committed suicide on social media, I think that's actually going to be a huge positive change. And I hate to say that. I think that actually will wake some people up. There are people out there who have suicidal people in their lives right now that they are ignoring, that are close to them. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I always, when I was a cop, I'd hear these calloused and almost people who would just maliciously talk about others who were suffering with no empathy, no regard for them whatsoever. And I just always used to say, I just want you to look. I want you to look at some of the things that I have to deal with. And these are your neighbors. These are people in your community, and you won't even look at it. You don't know. You know, you sit here in your ivory tower and you won't pay attention. And unfortunately, I feel very bad for the guy, and that should have never happened. But at the same time, there could be a lot of positives that come from that.
Yeah. There's a great quote in the Jewish Talmud that says, to save one life is to save the world. And I think if people can reflect on that and understand that to save anyone, whether they're suicidal, whether they're in the throes of a violent attack, to save one life is to save the world. It is to impact that. I mean, you are literally taking someone's world away. Right. So what would have happened if your father continued on? What would have happened if the gentleman who committed suicide, what would his life had impacted? Would he have been this, philosophical person? Would he have been this person that invented something new? Who knows? No one knows. And you can get, very nihilist about it. Like, it was just supposed to happen and he wasn't a part of this world. But I think if people can walk away with it, with understanding that to save that one person's life is to save not only that world, that all encompassing world of the self, but obviously how that person affects, their family and their family's families. Because obviously that had a trickle effect when your father committed suicide, how it impacted you, your family members, the extended family, the friends, coming and going as the years progressed, and how that was a ripple effect through your entire life, which brings us to finding his voice. What was it that finally was the breaking point, I guess you will, or the breakthrough that you decided to put pen to paper and start actually putting your thoughts and your feelings and this message of finding his voice out there to the world?
I mean, to be honest, it really was about that one person who is so full of pain and heartache that they can't see where they're currently at. They're drenched in it. They have sleepless, restless nights. They toss and turn in their bed. They wonder if all the thoughts that are going through their head are going to plague them the rest of their life. But deep down, they know there's something more. There's got to be something more, and they're desperate to find it. I have been that person. And so that's who this book is for. I wanted to get it into the hands of that hurting person because I've been there. I've been there multiple times. And so really it just kind of got to that tipping point. If I can't do that, if I can't spend my life inspiring hope and sharing what he has done in my life when I felt that way, if I can't get that into the hands of somebody who is hurting just like me, then my life was not what I hoped it would be. Like, that was such a passionate vision inside of me. Like, that really was the tipping point. Like, I have to do this. Yeah. I have to help that one.
What were the effects on you personally from your father's, tragic end? Did it affect your pursuit of happiness? Did it affect your wanting to live any further at a certain point? And talk to me a little bit about what was the breakthrough for you that said, you know what, I do have a purpose. I do have a vision. I've been able to find it. I've been able to channel these creative energies into something.
Absolutely. I mean, you don't go through something like that and not start thinking crazy serious. You start asking those questions of, what am I here for? What is the point of this life? Like, it's got to be bigger. And people really, really, really matter to the point of life and death. And so it kind of changes your vision and your perspective on life in so many different ways. It makes you ask those hard questions, and it gives you a different drive going through hard stuff like that, which I'm sure, Quentin, you can relate to. It changes you. But at the same token, it's been a journey, and it's been a wave. Like, it's not like I was on this straight line of like, okay, this happened and then it was just an uphill climb after that. No, it's a journey that is like a roller coaster. And on that roller coaster, finding that voice, the father that spoke to me when I lost my dad, as a soft, subtle whisper in the back of my spirit. And he said, "We got this. You and me, Jen. finding that voice and continuing to find him on that roller coaster of a journey that, you know, has been the last 16 years really was the story and all the different things that he has said at different moments as I tried to navigate everything, navigate my own head, navigate the voices around me. But finding those messages was really the key as life continued on. So like, as you read through the whole story, you're going to hear those nuggets of the different things that he said and how he continued to lead and guide and deposit his word versus another word into my spirit.
For sure. When you reached out to Dani, or was it her that reached out to you to be the forward in your book? And talk to me a little bit about, you know, having someone who is your coach, who is your mentor, who is someone that you've looked up to over the last year or 2 years, and having them be a part of this journey and writing words to start off your book. Can you express to me a little bit about that?
I could cry talking about it. Because to me, this book wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for her. Her transparency, her vulnerability, and her heart for people, and how she continues to fight through so many things to be as transparent as she is, showed me that I could have the courage to do the same thing. And well, you might ask, well, why? Because I too care about that one who is hurting. And her heart is so unmatched. The fact that she continues to be vulnerable, compassionate, and fights for that hurting person. Her courage gave me courage to do what I thought was the impossible, and that was to be completely transparent, share my story, share my struggle, share my pain, with the goal of reaching that one who is hurting and feels like they can't go on. And so she was actually the one who kicked me in the butt, honestly, to start writing it last October. Wow, that really wasn't that far ago. Last October. And that kick was exactly what I needed. She got me over some obstacles and fears that were in my head. And because of that, I ended up writing 17 chapters in 1 month.
Wow.
And then finished the whole book in a matter of 3 months. And so then you speed up to the completion of the book being done. There was no doubt in my mind who I wanted to ask to write the foreword, and I was completely blown away when she said yes, to the point that I literally, when I got the yes, I started running around my living room, jumping up and down in excitement because I couldn't believe it. I mean, you know how amazing our coach is and her heart for people, and so it was just such an honor to have her words in there, and to be able to partner with her in reaching more people who are hurting. And I know that that's her heart too. So.
And she has a great quote, and I'd love for you to expand on it, but she specifically talks about, if you learn more about people than you do anything else, you will be unusually successful. What does that mean to you?
Sorry, can you repeat it? Because it was choppy.
No worries. Yeah. So her quote is, if you learn more about people than you learn about anything else, you will be unusually successful. How does that relate to your interpretation, obviously, of what that means, but how does that relate to the topic of suicide?
I mean, it's so important. You want to be successful in being a voice against suicide. It's exactly what Quentin was saying. Listen, shut your mouth and listen to what this person is sharing. Ask them, what's their story? Why are they hurting? What are they going through? Give them that ear, and you're going to be successful in making an impact. What will that impact be? I don't know. But I can tell you this, they're going to feel like they were listened to. And people who are struggling are desperate for someone to care. They're desperate for someone to love them, and they're desperate for someone that will just sit down with them.
Yeah, I think to Quentin's point, the people nowadays are listening with the intent to respond versus the intent to understand. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that in our current events. We're seeing that with 101 plus days of rioting across multiple cities in the United States, that people are just listening to respond whether you agree with a platform or disagree. But we've gotten to we've talked about it on the show in the past, this false dialectic of this opinion and that's the only thing that matters, right? There is no common ground. There is no understanding. There is no compromise. There's just no listening. And we're seeing the results of that false dichotomy and that false dialectic, whereby there's just an exorbitant amount of violence and corruption and everything that we're seeing in our political atmosphere over the last 6 months, which, to our listeners and everyone listening today, happy 6-month anniversary of 15 days to slow the spread. And
I want to coin a term. I feel like what we're dealing with is binary logic predicated on a fallacy. So I'm going to coin, we live in a world of false binary logic.
Mm-hmm. It's tribalism. It's either, I was listening to Ravi.
I don't even know if it's tribalism. I mean, certain amounts of tribalism won't even lead to this type of stuff.
True.
This is just like, it's just literally two camps and they're A/B testing really bad ideas on us. Mm-hmm. It's like you have these people that control a vast, swath of society, and they have the means of manipulation, and they're like, let's A/B test these two ideas that we have, rigged, and we've set all of this up, and we'll just figure out where people want to move themselves into. I think it's too big to be tribe. It's like some sort of split nationalism.
For sure.
Or not even that, because there's no coherence on either one of the sides. It's literally just these false dialectics and consumerism, if you think about it.
I agree. There's been like no shortage of articles, and Quentin and I, we talked about this very early on in the episodes of what we saw the patterns were going to be. We discussed the fact that there was a poll very early on in March, April, that if people were still in lockdown, they would quite literally, and this was the quote, they would literally go insane. If the lockdowns went past June, that they would literally go insane. And as I was alluding to, there's no shortage of articles coming out now, again, hindsight, that suicide has taken more people than COVID itself. I'd love to get your perspective on that, Jen, and why you think that is. And then I'm going to dovetail into a separate but related topic of your partnership with King's Ransom and some of the aspects of this lockdown and seeing a 6,000% increase in child pornography and sexual abuse. And obviously those traumatic experiences lead to suicide or drug abuse. I mean, ultimately suicide is probably the biggest aspect of that, but just continuing that cycle. So talk to me a little bit about the shutdowns and the effects that's having on people's mental health, the suicide aspect to that, how people can reach out for help. And then I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your campaign to get this book out there, but also with a message to help King's Ransom.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I'm right there with you. I saw the statistics that suicide has risen, I think 42%. And that was something that was posted maybe a week or two ago. That's crazy amidst the COVID pandemic. And I can tell you, in my opinion, exactly why that's happening. It's because we're pumping fear and uncertainty into the public versus pumping hope, belief, and vision for the future. So we're literally driving people to suicide, which is horrible.
Hopelessness.
Imagine if we were pumping the opposite. Imagine if we were pumping hope, we were pumping belief that where you're at right now, it's not the end. Just hang in there. Let me give you some messages and some stories of people who have overcome instead. Imagine what that would do. That percentage would drop if they were getting hope. If they were getting a vision of what their future could be, what it will look like. What if we were told how much the Father loves us through social media? I'm pretty sure those numbers would drop. And
just artificially, so many people have lost their jobs. I mean, by dictum, right? I mean, like there's just been dictators here and there that have just said, "Hey, we're going to shut down the economy, and your entire livelihood is over." And instead, you're going to lose market share to big box and Amazon. And how in the world did they not think that was going to have an effect on the little guy who was already struggling? We're just now getting our feet, underneath us as far as the economy was concerned. We were on the rise, and it was over. And then it was just constant, like you said, constant bombardment on the psyche of Americans with just fear porn and hopelessness. I mean, if they didn't plan it to go this way, then we truly do have a complete lack of quality leadership in the country.
Yep.
And if they did plan it this way, then we have malicious leaders.
That's the thing. We, as a public, we're not taught how to deal with trauma. We're not taught how to deal with bad news. Imagine if our schools were teaching us how to deal with grief, how to deal with losing a job, how to deal with loss of somebody that you love, because those things are probably going to happen. So instead, what if we were teaching our children how to navigate that, how to keep your head straight on your shoulders and protect the thoughts that are coming to it, how to battle those thoughts, how to battle your own mind, how to listen for the Father. What if we were teaching our children how to navigate that stuff versus what they're teaching now?
And there's a total lack of life skills and just quality education for the youth. And that's not just now. I mean, that's our age group too. We had a complete lack of quality education and anything valuable, you know. And it was all seemingly to like kind of program us for careers that weren't there when we graduated high school. So
yeah, it's very much the Fight Club, Tyler Durden philosophy of, you know, we buy things for people we don't like. We consume things just because it's the American way. You brought up education, and I'd love to get your point of view. And Quentin, obviously your point of view on this is, if we were doing that in schools now through, you know, either homeschooling or public education, if we were doing that now, would we even be seeing defunding the police or these types of riots and violent outbursts that are happening throughout the country? If we were investing in our children, and I stress the word investing, you know, last time I checked, I didn't use the quadratic theory or Pythagorean theory today. You know, like, is it important if you're going to get into the STEM area? Maybe, possibly, but nurture that. But if we were investing more time, would we need to have these conversations around defunding the police? Because in all actuality, you wouldn't say defund the education system because kids aren't passing tests, teachers aren't doing their job correctly, they're not meeting test scores or curriculums. You wouldn't look at a school district and say, that's a very poor performing school district, we should defund them. You would say the exact opposite. We need to get more teachers. We need to get better education. We need to adjust the curriculum. So if we were doing that in schools now, the conversation around defund the police, I don't believe would be happening to the extent that it was. If we were training our men and women on how to deal with suicide, because it's obviously going to affect them. If we were training them, Jocko Willenick has a great philosophy, a great point of view on that, is if police and law enforcement were training like they were Navy SEALs, not in that military aspect of it, but if they were spending 20% of their on-the-job training instead of just here's 8 to 10 weeks of, you know, police boot camp and then sending them out on the street and good luck. You know, this goes back to the question, if we were doing this in schools, would we be seeing a world like we are today?
I think not. I think it would look drastically different. I think that's a huge problem. Imagine if we had even just one class that was mandatory and the subject was mental health in general. Imagine all the things we could include inside of that and be able to prepare our society for change, to prepare our society for trauma and effects that can then later cause, you know, horrible things if we don't know how to be prepared for them, if we don't know how to expect them and how to walk through them, knowing that we have a vision that's beyond them versus getting stuck in what we're currently in. I really think that we could see a very different society if we were training our kids in mental health, and ourselves as well. I mean, we only go for help with mental health if we think we need a counselor, we think we need a therapist. So those are great things, but imagine if we were proactive with it and we were constantly getting walked through this stuff that you're going to be dealing with anyways.
Yep.
So you might as well be proactive with it, and let's
All of it's
teach
very
people
reactive.
how to walk through it. Right. Yep.
I have to agree. And I am very much a fatalist, and that doesn't mean like I'm morbid and think about death and stuff like that, or it's not, that's not what it means. I believe there is a fate, right? And you just can't, your choice when these situations are presented to you is all of yours, but the situations you're going to be in are the situations you were always going to be in. And once I really understood what fatalism was and accepted my fate, and then tried to live within that fate instead of constantly trying to fight it or trying to, go back in time or try to change things I couldn't change, I was a much happier person. And I think that there is too much. Yes, you have a motivating factor, or you have some control over your destiny. Your choices are yours and the situations you're presented in. But I think there's just too much desire, because we live in this technologically advanced age, to program kids from a young age. It's like, oh, look at all of the amazing breakthroughs we're on the cusp of. We're going to cure cancer. We can, cure disease. We're going to have, quantum teleportation, all this crazy stuff in the future. And I think people believe that they can change fate in some way, and that, their life doesn't have to be exact, and it doesn't. Your choice, like I said, is yours. But the situations you're presented, you need to adapt, and you need to be taught and given the tools and be proactive on how to adapt to those situations and succeed and thrive in those situations. You can't constantly just beat yourself up and bog yourself down like I had done for so many years about all the things that I had seen. That wasn't doing me any good. I just had to adapt. And now I see the benefit of being in those situations, being in those high stress situations, taught me a lot about myself. And it also gave me an opportunity to be there for people when they needed me. And I don't think that this conversation is being had with people anymore. I think people feel like they have too much control over reality, and that's just not the case. Also, you brought up something interesting about the educational system. And this is why I'm like, I used to be very anti-tribal. My mentality was like, the tribe is bad, tribalism is bad. I'm not so sure anymore. I've been thinking about this more philosophically. Actually, I'm pretty sure it's better than what we have. The reason I say that is we live in a very diverse society, right? We have a very diverse country. If people did have, let's say, tribes, if they had their cliques or their identity and they totally embraced those identities, you would not have a majority out there that had the authority or the capability to burn stuff down. It just wouldn't happen. What you have right now is almost, like I said, like an A/B testing of universal globalism. It's just universalist type commercial propaganda, and then just A/B testing two different variations on society. You see that in school too. It is very much a conformist, universalist institution of dogma. It's almost like a religious experience that everyone has to go and perform these certain rituals and do these certain things. And it totally takes the individual, and there's different, cliques and identities within those schools where people are good at language arts, people are good at science, people are good at math, people like music. And those little tribes form very naturally in school. And people will say, oh, that's artificial or whatever. No, probably not. If you took away that construct altogether, people would probably follow their passions and their interests and fall into those things anyway, right? And while I do agree, I think that maybe things are taught a little too young, but I will say this, they're taught really badly. I got to go to school later in life, and I went for STEM, and I took very advanced science courses and math courses. And for example, like calculus, algebra, trigonometry, they seem really pointless because they just teach you these equations. They just teach you these math problems, but they won't actually teach you they were all designed to shoot cannons. Like this was all designed for ballistics applications. This was all designed to map and predict patterns within firearms, artillery, and stuff like that. And it makes a lot of sense when you look at it from a rocketry perspective. That's what the whole presupposition behind Newtonian physics was, launching a cannonball off of the planet, how much velocity it would take to do this. And it's not taught that way anymore. It's just like, here's the equation, let's balance it. I don't know if they won't teach it like this anymore because it's not PC to teach kids like about ballistics. I don't know. I know that it was once taught that way. It was once taught in a model rocketry format not too long ago. And for whatever reason, even in my age group, and this was, 15 years ago that I was learning this stuff in high school, we weren't taught that way. And if it had been taught to me in a way, with vectors and airplanes or rockets or guns or something like that, I would have probably found it fascinating and I would have done really, really well. But maybe it's designed to weed kids out like me who would have done really well and who did do very well with it later on in life, and just kind of leave us behind or just push us out in general. And it takes a kid who will just look at a bunch of data sets and equations and say, oh, I was told to do this, and this is the way I was told to do it, and I won't ever ask why or what the purpose is. I'm just going to do it. And those kids are very successful. And I think that's a real problem because those kids generally have a problem with abstraction. They're generally very good computationally, and they're generally very bad abstracting their own equations. So
we don't do a very good job of nurturing people's talents, and we just put them into this standard operating procedure of education. Quentin, I want to kind of dovetail on your comment on fate, and I have a reminder, and that's tattooed on my arm just because I really got into the philosophy behind what Marcus Aurelius was teaching. And Marcus Aurelius had a quote in his meditations that said, you could leave this life today. You can frame that in a suicide point of view, or just the fact that you're taken out of life. A bus could hit you, whatever, lightning strikes, but you could leave this life today. Let that determine what you say, think, and do. And I think if you embrace that, not necessarily embracing Stoic philosophy, but embracing that you are not your circumstances. I love your quote that where you are right now is not the end. If you can embrace, call it fate, call it circumstances, if you can embrace it without the exterior things affecting the interior motivations, then you can navigate your life a little bit easier. If all these external circumstances aren't making you mad, they aren't making you depressed, you have some control over that with respect to how you react to outside forces. But I want to bring it back, Jen, to your mission in this book and your partnership with King's Ransom. And if you're not familiar with King's Ransom, they help the widows and the orphans, but one of their biggest projects is rescuing children from the sex trade. And I had firsthand experience with this, with their partnership with a ministry out of California that was no longer feasible for them to operate out of California, and they actually moved to Central Texas. And it's one of those, again, and I want to get your perspective on this as well. Like, just the topic of suicide is very taboo, and we don't talk about it because it's scary. But also the topic of sex trafficking is very taboo, and it's only recently gotten a lot of traction. And depending on how the algorithm is working in your social media feed, you might be seeing a lot more of it more recently. But with King's Ransom and their fight against sex trafficking, witnessing this firsthand, literally sitting with these young women, having breakfast with them and hearing their stories, and they're just normal kids. And you wouldn't be able to pick them out of a crowd to think that they were being either trafficked by their father, trafficked by their uncle, trafficked by, just the circumstances are far and wide, but it all comes down to the same. They're being abused, they're being used for nefarious purposes, for the enjoyment of others, for the perversion of others. But the effect that has on a child, on a grown person, no less, can end up in suicide. So Jen, talk to me a little bit about why you're passionate about helping King's Ransom in that fight, but also in obviously their other missions of feeding the widows and the orphans.
Absolutely. Well, like we were saying earlier, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and asking, what is this person going through? What's their story? Is so important. And, a lot of times we think that our story doesn't matter, but actually there's power in your story. And I want you to think about this for a second. So obviously we've been talking about my book, Finding His Voice. When we launched the book, we announced that for a 24-hour period, 100% of the profits were going to go to King's Ransom Foundation, the organization Sal was just talking about. In that 24 hours, we raised over just around $1,000 for King's Ransom Foundation to go help these girls that are being rescued from the sex trade and to feed and house orphans and widows around the world. So think about that. There is power in your story. My story, sharing my story, being willing to be vulnerable, partnering with King's Ransom Foundation, then brought $1,000 just in one day to help these girls, to help these families, to help people who need to hear that they matter and that they're important, that their life matters, and that we're going to help. Yeah. So at the end of the book, I talk about a movement called the Overcomers, and am trying to remind people that your story does matter. You can do things like that. You can do things like what I did. And it doesn't stop there. As we continue to make sales, we're going to be giving a portion of our profits to King's Ransom Foundation because we care about the long haul. We care about partnering with companies like this who care about hurting people like we do. But there's actual power in your story if you're listening today. There is power in the word of your testimony. And that's what the Overcomers is all about that I talk about at the end of the book. Do you think your story doesn't matter? I would actually challenge you to read Revelations 12:10 through 12, because your story is what triumphs over the enemy. There's a verse in verse 11, I've got it right up in front of me, that says, they triumphed over him, they're talking about the enemy, by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. How amazing is that? How oftentimes are we told that our testimony, our story, actually has power associated to it because of the blood of the Lamb? We're not told that, or at least we're not reminded of that. Yeah. And so there's a lot more that we can do as far as getting our story out there, being willing to talk about things, being willing to be vulnerable. You'd be surprised by who you can help and the hurting hearts that you can reach in doing so.
So, of course, people can find your book on Amazon, wherever books are sold, I'm imagining. Where can people share their stories?
Yep. So right now you can email us at The Overcomers. There's a Facebook page. We have an Instagram account, and there's a website as well. So if you visit any of those, you're going to see the email address where you can email in your story. And we're actually going to be, as time progresses, sharing other people's stories and announcing a lot more exciting things as the months roll by, because really this is the launch. We just want people to know that their story matters and that there's power in it. And this is not just about my story. You've got a story, and together we can help a lot more people, because my story is only going to relate to people who can relate to what I've gone through. And yes, it will help those people, but your story can reach people that my story can't. And so that's the idea and the vision behind the Overcomers is let's help more people. Let's come together as the Overcomers and let's inspire hope into a lot more hurting people that are out there.
That's amazing. Yeah, people don't know the power of their circle, whether it's 10 people, that 10 people magnifies and is exponential, and being able to share that testimony and having the courage to step out of that comfort zone and admit to some things. I think if you can start from a place of forgiveness for yourself, you can then find healing and forgiveness of others, whether it's a parent, a brother, a sister, a colleague, whatever. If you can move into that and start with forgiveness for yourself, you can really open up some opportunities for healing and finding the vision, because I think a lot of people are just supremely blocked in finding their vision because of the wall that has 4 big letters on it, fear, F-E-A-R. And that's a huge wall that people have a huge time, getting over or knocking it down. We like to ask one question at the end of the show. I'm going to start with you with 2 questions at the end of the show. If you had access to a billboard, what would your message be to our audience and to those who would be passing by this billboard?
I would say where you're at now is not the end.
That's perfect. That's a perfect philosophy to just kind of understand that the road does not stop just because the wheel fell off the wagon, right? There's still a road ahead. There's still a path. And the final question, what does the new normal mean to you, and how can people utilize that perception of the new normal, the way you define it, to help them get out of the hole that they might be in?
I mean, I think it comes down to two things. One, taking the time to listen to those around you, to ask that question, what is this person's story that's standing right in front of me? Why have they crossed paths with me today? Is there maybe a reason? Am I supposed to speak life into this person? There's probably a reason this person has crossed your path. So taking the moment to ask them, hey, what's your story? Who are you? Asking those questions, letting them speak, letting them share some struggles they might be going through, and then speaking life into them, like taking that extra second to do that. And then two is that we can make the choice to overcome, but will you choose to be an overcomer and step out of the past? Because our words can either cause faith or fear to grow.
Very good.
And to me, that's the new normal. Taking the time to pay attention to that person who has crossed your path and really listen. And second, making the choice to step out of the past, to choose to be an overcomer, and to choose to allow faith to grow instead of fear.
Very powerful. Jen, I want to take some time to acknowledge you for this passion that you are bringing to this topic, and your drive and motivation to share your story and the pursuit of finding his voice, finding a way through the darkness that is in people's life. I want to acknowledge you for your courage to share your story, to share the traumatic experiences and how that shaped your life, and how that's ultimately come out into this amazing book, Finding His Voice, where people can understand that they are truly not alone. I think we hear that so much and it's become so cliche, but there's power and there's truth to understanding that you are not alone, that there's someone there's nothing new under the sun, as scripture says. There's nothing new under the sun, and what you are going through, there's someone else who's either gone through it or is going through it with you, or can go through it with you. And to seek help and to find someone who will truly listen, who will truly want to understand what you're going through, versus just responding and saying, get over it. Jen, do you have any final comments or any resources that people can go to that are struggling with suicidal thoughts, or just truly need someone to talk to? Are there any resources that you might be able to point us to?
Absolutely. I mean, top of the list is the Suicide Prevention Line, which if you just Google that right into the internet, that's going to pop up. And then also, if you're not familiar with the lady we talked about earlier in the call, her name is Dani Johnson. You can visit danijohnson.com and visit their website. There's an amazing team of people who would love to take the time to listen to you. They have had a profound impact on my story and my journey. And this book happened because they listened to me. So I would encourage you to give them a call as well.
Awesome. Those links will be in the show notes for this particular episode. Guys, I want to thank you so much for listening. I want to acknowledge our audience for sticking with us, even though we took a month off. We are getting back in the swing of things, getting our consistency on track. I want to acknowledge you guys for commenting on our Facebook page. If you are not subscribed to this channel, please do so on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you download your favorite podcast. We'd love to be a part of that. And we want to thank you so much for listening. Jen, thank you again for being our guest. Quentin, any final words?
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. No, I had a great time. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I think people need to hear this. And I knew what your book was about, and I knew your story, but I was still very hesitant to, just because I didn't really want to. I really didn't want to share my own. I knew I was going to, so I was really hesitant to do the show. But I'm really glad I did, and it was a pleasure meeting you.
Same to you as well, Quentin. And thank you so much for being willing to share some vulnerable stuff during the call. I know that a lot of people listening can relate to what you shared and what you've been through and the feelings that you've been through. And you're not alone in that either. And so I just want to thank you both for doing this podcast, for being willing to talk about hard things. May that be the new normal, that we're willing to talk about the hard things in order to help people, to create a different voice, a voice that offers hope, a voice that asks questions, and a voice that says, hey, where you're at right now is not the end. So I thank you guys. I thank you guys so much for what you're doing and your courage to be out there and do something different.
Newly minted author Jenny Horling with her voice, with her book, Finding His Voice, available on Amazon. You can get it right now. The link will be in our show notes. If you're interested, buy 1 copy, buy 2 copies, give it to a friend, share this message with everyone that you can. Jen, thank you once again for joining us on The New Normal. And as always, welcome to the new normal.